Darcy, take it away.
Okay, I think you can hear me, right? And
You sound great. And we can see your screen.
you can see the PowerPoint?
Looks great.
Okay, we're good to go. Okay. Well, we're almost through the program tonight, so we'll try to liven it up a little bit with a little talk on field crop diseases. As always, as the field crop pathologist, I want to just discuss the disease triangle and what we need to be watching for when we worry about diseases, and then talk a little bit about what we've seen using different fungicide programs across the state and some of those diseases that we're monitoring. So the first thing when we talk about diseases, then we need to have three factors occurring in a field in order to have a disease issue occur. And the first is do we have a susceptible host? So those are the corn or soybean planted in that field. And then second is that pathogen present. So a lot of our pathogens we're looking at, gray leaf spot, frog eye leaf spot in soybeans. Is the pathogen present? Has that field had a history of that? Are we building up inoculum? Those that are already here, they're overwintering and they're already present. So then the biggest factor of whether we'll see a disease in a season is that environment. And many of our fungal pathogens really require water and moisture conditions and certain temperature conditions to occur. So if that favorable environment is there, we'll see a lot of disease develop. But say we go hot and dry, and we had many areas this year that were dry this season, that is less favorable for many of our fungal pathogens for their spores to germinate and infect the plant, therefore reducing that disease risk for a field. And so, if we get the favorable environments like we saw in 2018, we had a lot of moisture, we saw a lot of frog eye leaf spot move in. Those are the conditions that are really going to promote some of those diseases that are overwintering and here on an annual basis. And then when we turn, when we're trying to manage diseases, there are four main areas we can look at. First, can we find a hybrid or variety that has genetic resistance that's acting on that host part of the triangle? Will crop rotation help reduce some of that inoculum that's surviving year to year? Again, acting on the host and pathogen of the triangle. We can use sanitation, either by tillage. If we can till the field, we can bury some of the inoculum, reducing the number that's available. And then also think about some of our soil-borne pathogens. We may be able to move them with machinery between fields. So it's important to understand where the pathogen is surviving and how we might be able to manage that field to try to reduce the disease. And then finally, make a decision of whether a pesticide or a fungicide is going to be useful. Again, all of these management tactics are acting on the host or the pathogen side of that triangle. The one thing we cannot control is that environmental conditions, and that really is what's going to dictate year to year what pathogens are going to be present. So I just thought I'd talk about a few of the major diseases we watch here in Indiana for corn and soybeans. So the main one I think about is gray leaf spot. This disease is found throughout the state. It's surviving in the soil year to year, and we call it a bottom-up disease. So when we're starting to scout and look for this disease to try to make a decision if we want to apply a fungicide, we need to look at that lower crop canopy. Are we starting to see those classic symptoms of frog eye leaf spot, the angular, or gray leaf spot, the angular lesions forming on those lower leaves? Is it starting to move up in the crop canopy with the goal that if we want to put out a fungicide, the idea is we want to protect that ear leaf and above so we can get the optimum yield from that crop. Another disease we may be watching for is northern corn leaf blight. This disease may be found throughout the crop canopy as those spores move a little higher within that crop canopy when they sporulate. A third disease that we watch here in Indiana is southern corn rust. This disease we track nationally. This one does not overwinter in Indiana, so every year we start fresh and we monitor its movement from the south, Georgia, Alabama. Is it moving up? Will it be moved here in Indiana early enough to cause impact? This disease, we do need samples to confirm it, to distinguish the two different spore types from our common rust and the southern rust. Again, the southern rust is what could cause significant yield impacts and does impact corn production in the south. And finally, the fourth disease that generally we're starting to see here in Indiana that's gotten a lot of PR press in the last few years is tar spot. And at the end, I'm going to show you what we've learned so far about this disease, where I think the risks are within the state, and what we've learned on how the best management practices for this disease. But again, these are the four foliar diseases I think here in Indiana we monitor and watch to try to make a decision on using a fungicide. There are 10, 15 more other diseases we can run across but many of those aren't going to be controlled by using fungicides. If we look at soybeans, I think our biggest concern, if we're going to make a foliar application for controlling disease, is frog eye leaf spot. If you have a susceptible variety, you need to be scouting early R1 to be looking to see if you can find any of these lesions in the crop canopy. That will guide your decision on whether a fungicide would be needed to try to manage this disease. A few other diseases that may be out there in the crop canopy include Cercospora leaf blight, same genus as the frog eye leaf spot, but this one causes the purple bronzing of that upper leaves and can lead to that purple seed stain we saw a lot of in 2018. And another common disease we quite frequently see is Septoria brown spot. This disease is in the lower canopy. Generally, we don't worry about it impacting yield, but it is present and has the potential, if the conditions are conducive, to move up in the crop canopy as well. So we're looking for these diseases, scouting and trying to make an informed decision, and then trying to understand what the best timing for our fungicides should be. So here's just a general diagram of the optimum timing that has been determined for using fungicides both in corn and soybeans. So we're scouting late vegetative stages in corn to try to make that decision to spray at the VTR1, especially for gray leaf spot in corn. And then soybeans, we're scouting R1 to R2, looking for frog eye to make a decision to spray at R3. So if the disease is present in the crop canopy, we make a decision, we make a fungicide application. Generally, our fungicides are going to provide us 2 to 3 weeks of residual protection within the crop canopy. And so the idea is we want to lay that fungicide down when the canopy is most at risk for the disease to cause yield impacts. Maybe in another field, the diseases didn't move in quite so early, but you see some moving in later. They may get sprayed a couple weeks beyond that VTR1. That fungicide application would then extend that fungicide further out into the season, maybe getting you a little closer to reaching maturity at R5 and R6. And maybe we don't see much disease. Soybeans were relatively quiet this season, and we don't really need to make a fungicide application if the disease is moved in late at the season. The diseases aren't going to multiply and cause enough damage to see significant yield impacts. And then you want to think about your return on investment on using a fungicide. So again, the idea is we want to spray those fungicides when we know the diseases may be moving up into those crop canopies and can impact the yield of those various crops. Some work that's been done on looking at gray leaf spot, and I think this is can be useful for all the other diseases that we talk about, is how much of that ear leaf is affected by the disease. If we can keep 5% or less, we're really not going to see any yield losses occur in the field. When we see 6 to 25% of that ear leaf being lost, we could potentially lose up to 10% of the yield. And as that disease progresses, if we lose that ear leaf or above, we may see up to 50% yield loss. So our idea is we really want to protect that upper canopy, keep the disease at a minimum, and try to just make a decision on when the best to spray those fungicides when they're needed, and not spraying them. Maybe it's not necessary to spray them if they're not needed. And the other thing to think about is your return on investment. So this is just looking at corn. Again, if a $3 to $4 corn, the idea is we want to, if we put a fungicide out, we need about 5 to 11 bushels per acre protected to return that investment on adding that fungicide cost. And looking at that, if you then decide you want to make a fungicide application, there's 3 resources that are available. These, the efficacy tables that we put together, they're from the data throughout the United States, evaluating the mode of actions of all the different fungicide groups for the various diseases that we see in corn, soybean, and wheat. So these tables are available. We'll be updating them again in February as we continue to get more information on the various new modes of action that are out there. And this is just an example of one of those tables. So this is the one I took from last year in the corn diseases. So the common diseases that we do use fungicides to control, like common rust, eye spot, gray leaf spot, northern corn leaf blight. We did add a tar spot column. This generally showed those fungicides that had a label. Generally, those that had a label had a good to very good rating. So the idea is you can use this table, look up some of your fungicide groups, and try to cross-reference them to see how effective they are in the various diseases. So here's just an example. Proconazole Tilt is a trade name. It gets about a good rating for gray leaf spot, but if you look at Trivapro with a 3-way mix, it has an excellent rating. So these tables can be very useful to try to identify products that you may want to use. If you're looking at generics, you can cross-reference the active ingredients and try to determine what active ingredients are most effective for the various diseases. So these are available both for corn, soybean, and wheat if you're looking. And so then the next question is, how often do we get a yield benefit with putting a fungicide out in corn and in soybeans? Recently, they did a number of meta-analysis of a number of trials conducted in 12 states in Ontario from 2014 to 2015, looking at putting out a fungicide no matter what the disease pressure was and what is the resulting yield increase. So they looked at 2 different fungicide classes. They looked at the QOIs and then the DMIs plus the QOIs, and then 3 different timings. So a V6 plus VT, so we were hitting that field twice with a fungicide application, V6 alone, and then VT. So they, compiled all these data from all the different states and tried to look at overall what was the yield increase. So if you can see here, overall for the QOIs, the double hit with the V6 plus VT had about a 3.8% yield increase. And then the DMI, the 2 modes of action, had about a 4% increase with the V6 plus VT application timing, so a hit twice in the field. But you can see that optimum, that VT that we talk about, that one alone just had a 3.6% yield increase. So again, it's the VT timing, especially if we have diseases occurring, that is the big one that helps protect yield at the end of the season. So then they went and they separated out the data. So this is just looking at the frequency of positive yield responses at the various application timings. This is looking at that double mode of action, the DMI plus the strobilurin. And as you can see at the V6 application, about 70% of the time, they had a positive yield response when a fungicide was added as compared to a non-treated. And that averaged about 2.97 bushels per acre. So that still doesn't really get us to the return on investment if we look at the yields we need to protect in order to pay for that fungicide. If we look at the VT application, about 73% of the time there was a positive positive yield benefit, with that mean being about 7.2. So here, yes, you can see that that VT application timing is more ideal than an earlier application at V6. Again, the V6 would have run out of steam by the time many of our pathogens are active later in the season. And then looking at that combination of V6 plus VT, about 75% of the time there was a positive yield response with about 8 bushels per acre. So again, if you added the cost of having 2 applications of fungicide out there, it's probably not getting you that return on investment versus a 1 good well-timed VT application in the middle of the season. If we look at that breaking even across the United States, here's looking at the different values of corn. So $2 to $3, $4, and $5 bushel corn. You can see that if our fungicides on average are $20 to $25 an acre, we get a return on our costs about 42 to 62% of the time. And this is just looking at that VT application. So that just gives you an idea. If you're just going to decide to spray fungicides no matter what disease is active, this is about the chances you'll get a return on putting that fungicide out there. If you look at the combination of the V6 plus VT, so again, we've bumped our fungicide costs up. So now we're at $35 to $45 an acre. The chance of recovering your cost is about 15 to 45%. So again, we've lowered our chances in getting a recovery on adding that fungicide if we're just going to spray both times, and no regards to the diseases that are occurring in the field. We recently just published the meta-analysis looking at this at the soybean side of things. So this data is from 240 field trials across the United States from 2015 to 2018. And if you took all those trials together, no matter what the background of disease was, they had about a 2.7 yield response when those fungicides were applied at R3 over the non-treated plots. Most of these were mixed modes of action. So if you had 2 or 3 ingredients within your fungicide, that increased yield average is about 3%. We do see a better yield response when the soybeans were planted before the 21st of May, and when there was a higher risk of precipitation, where they had above average precipitation, that's also going to lead us to higher risks of those fungal diseases developing within the canopy. The thoughts on this one is, again, using a foliar fungicide is less likely to be profitable when we don't have that risk of those foliar diseases or they're at very low levels. So again, this is just some data we've been compiling to try to look at the effectiveness of if you just decide to go out and spray all your fields, what is the chances of getting a return on that added input cost for managing diseases. But pulling back the reins a little bit, instead of encouraging everybody just to roll the dice and spray fields, I do want to remind you that we do have fungicide resistance that can quickly develop within our pathogen systems. Frog eye leaf spot, for example, is one that we're tracking right now. And just like when we talked about herbicide resistance, the more times we continue to apply fungicides on an annual basis to the same fields, we're going to select those pathogen populations that are more resistant to that fungicide. So again, just like if we're looking at herbicide resistance for your weeds, the same thing can happen with our fungi. We spray one time, we select for those fungi that may be resistant, that they're already present in the population. And if we continue to apply this pressure year after year, we're going to select for those populations that are resistant. And one example of this is the QOI, the strobilurin resistance that has developed in soybeans. So we do know we have QOI fungicide resistance here in Indiana. In 2010, it was first reported in the United States. It's currently been detected in 18 states, and it may be 19 or 20 by now. That first, before I arrived, they had confirmed 4 counties that had QOI resistance here in Indiana. We started monitoring field populations across the state. I have a student that's working on this project, Natalia, and she was collecting samples through 2019 and 2020 to try to see how widespread is this resistance beyond just those 4 first counties that we've confirmed it in. So in 2019, we were able to collect a number of samples from 10 counties across the state, and of those 10 counties and 144 different isolates that she collected in 2019, 71% of them were resistant to the QOIs. They contain that one gene switch that causes that pathogen population to be resistant to those strobilurin fungicides. We did have one county, though. We were not able to find any resistant mutants from that county, so Lawrence County, we still haven't been able to find that. So again, we've now added 9 new counties. This is from the 2019 sampling. We are currently in the process of collecting the samples. We have over 200 isolates from 2020 to try to get a further how widespread it is. I think she's got 30 different counties she's looking at for 2020. So stay tuned. I suspect that the QOI resistance is pretty much widespread throughout the state, but it is important to understand how widespread and how mixed are those populations. Do we still have populations out there that do show, that aren't resistant to the QOIs as compared to those that are? And then finally, the other things my team has been doing is trying to track various diseases across the state. So not only do we track southern corn rust, but we've been tracking tar spot since its 2018 epidemic. So this is the new 2020 map. As you can see, there are 2 new states, if you want to, that we found tar spot in. Pennsylvania found it this season, and then it also jumped into Canada as well. So the disease is continuing to spread. Here in Indiana, we first found tar spot. It was found in 2015 with 7 counties. Initially, we really didn't see it was going to cause a big impact, but annually we've continued to add slowly. We slowly added counties. It's been here, it's been present, it's overwintering. So 2018 was the year we had the right environmental conditions. This disease requires a lot of moisture for the spores to germinate. It needs 8 hours of leaf wetness in order to get in and cause infection. So in 2018, when we had that first epidemic, we were able to find it in 25 new counties. 2019, we tried to do a survey and we again added 25 more counties. So we're up to 66 counties in Indiana. And then in this season, we actually got into all 92 counties across the state, adding 12 new counties. But there are 14 counties that we could not find it. Now, granted, we were only got into 1 or 2 fields in a county, depending on our time. But again, there are a number of counties in the southern part of the state that are gray that we still weren't able to find tar spot. But that being said, we were able again this season to find active tar spot in all of those 78 counties. But it's not just important to me to understand whether the disease is in a county, it's also important to understand were the conditions conducive for the disease to really impact yield. So when we go out and scout and look for tar spot, we also take a rating on that field. We rate the severity of the plant, how severe did the infection occur. If we're only finding one stromata on a leaf, so this little black spot here, that's really not going to impact yield. It does tell me that the pathogen's present and it may be there for future seasons, but it's really not going to impact yield. It's when we get up to this 5 to 7 to 25% severity, that's when we're starting to see those significant yield impacts that we see. So we took this data, and I just want to acknowledge that the conditions for 2020 were significantly different from 2019. We had a lot of areas where we had high drought, and this is looking at July, looking at the drought monitors. So if we look at 2019, we had some areas with a little yellow area of drought, but in 2020, most of the state was under this bright yellow orange area for drought. And then it's also continued through August. So up in the northern part of the state, where we generally see the impact of tar spot, we had significant dry conditions in 2020. So unless those fields were supplemented with irrigation, we really saw a minimum amount of disease develop when looking at tar spot. So we took that information when we went to the fields. We looked at how frequent could I find tar spot in the corn, so how many plants were infected, and then how severe was that infection. So the first set of maps here on the left is the number of plants that we would find. So the bright orange areas, every plant had a tar spot stromata on it that we looked in the field. And then the middle is that leaf severity. So how severe was the leaf? The lighter the color, the less severity, lower severity on that leaf. The darker the orange, the more severity. So as you can see from 2019 to 2020, we're starting to see more fields with more tar spot being found more readily across the state. But when we look at the ear leaf severity, those leaves weren't as severely infected in 2020 as they were in 2019. Here, as you can see up in northern Indiana, that's where we had that significant epidemic, and that's where we continue to see this annual problem. When we combine that information together, we get what we call an index, and that's what the maps on the right are showing, is that index map. So again, it's kind of what if we look at 2019, northern part of the state is where we see the most impact on yield, where we're seeing that 11 to 20 bushel yield loss from this disease, up to 20 bushels, 60 bushels as we reported. But if you look at that, which I want to caution looking at southern Indiana, is that we are starting to see these little pockets appear. And I think when you look at the disease triangle, what we're doing is we're slowly starting to build up that inoculum within some of our fields. And then if they're the right conditions, if we have the right rains, if we have the right morning dews, we might be at higher risk for some of our southern fields that may have this disease to see significant impacts in the future. Right now, I still am worried more about northern Indiana, but again, we do have some of these pockets where we're more readily finding the disease than we had previously in 2019. So that being said, the next question is, what do we need to do about it? I'm going to run out of time as I see, but we've been evaluating a bunch of different products, and we just finished our second year of evaluations. What we do is, we have a great spot up at Penny Purdue to evaluate some of these fungicides. We started with our common VTR1 application. We have a 2 to 3 week window where the fungicide is protecting the crop. In our non-treated canopy, we see this rapid disease development at the end of the season. Where we put our fungicides out, we shift that disease curve down. You can see all the fungicides really significantly reduce the disease that develops. But once those fungicides run out of their steam, tar spot can take off, especially if there's still green leaf tissue to infect. So this is what we saw in 2019. We had a similar results in 2020. The disease didn't move in quite as early in 2020, but again, you can see most of our fungicides are reducing that disease curve and reducing the amount of disease that develops within the crop canopy. If we look overall at that area under disease progress curve, so that area under those curves, again, many of our fungicides, and this is looking at the ear leaf -2, the ear leaf, and then the ear leaf +2, across all those leaves, we are able to reduce tar spot within the crop canopy. The question is, what does that mean in the result in regards to yield? So in 2019, there was some variability across our plots. They weren't significantly different, but we do see about an 11.3 bushel per average increase in yield when what fungicide was put out. And if I looked across all the various trials we had across the state, it ran about 11 to 20 bushel on average benefit of putting a fungicide out when tar spot got significantly high in those crop canopies. When we look at 2020, again, we're starting to see some of the new products separate out. There are some that may have a longer persistence and significantly reduce the disease in the crop canopy. And then we look at the effect of those on yield. Here we can see that we had about, some of those products had a 30 bushel average increase in yield over the untreated. So it is good news that we do have some fungicides out there that are really effective in minimizing tar spot, and they do provide some yield protection and minimizing the impact of the disease on the crop. And I'm just going to skip ahead a little bit. The other question is timing, and I'm going to skip ahead to so we were trying to decide what's the best timing for fungicides. When we go early at the V7 to V9, we're not shifting that disease curve. Those later application timings seem to be more effective. In 2020, I'm going to skip ahead, we added later application timing. So we had a lot of questions about going out late. If I sprayed at R2, what about R4, R5? So we put fungicides out at all those various timings. And these results are really interesting, and I think I'll stop after this. So the early vegetative stages, we really didn't change the disease curve going out at V8, V10. Those fungicides had run out of steam by the time the disease was active. Our VT, R2 applications, though, really did shift that disease curve down, are helping control the disease. But if we look at R3, R4, R5, they came in too late and they couldn't get ahead of tar spot. So I think it's really important that we need to be tracking this disease and understanding the best timing, and again, staying at our VT, maybe pushing it to R2 would be the most effective for this disease. So I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. The other thing we were looking at was southern rust. And I just want to acknowledge that we monitor this disease, and this one I think in southern Indiana is the one we need to monitor more closely. Both last year and this year it's moved in early. These are our plots at SEPAC. You can see we got hit really hard with southern rust at the end of the season. We had fungicide trials out there, so this is the non-treated control plot, and then one of our fungicide application plots. So we do know we have fungicides that are really good at controlling southern rust, but again, it's the impact on yield. And really in both years, in 2019 and 2020, we aren't seeing that yield separation that I'd like to see. The disease really just isn't building up enough to really impact the yield. So again, it's monitoring when the diseases move in and whether that fungicide application would provide a yield benefit. So from that, I'm going to end since I've run over time. And I'm just going to share, if you're interested, we try to track these various diseases on my Purdue website. So we'll have both the tar spot, the active counties when we find it in season, and southern rust as it moves in each year from the south. We are working on compiling our 2020 field data, so stay tuned. Hopefully we'll have it out by the end of the month or early January. And again, there's some other publications that are available if you have any questions. So I'll turn it over to questions if there is any. If I zoom through it, if you have any other questions on diseases.
Dr. Telenko, thank you so much. That was a great presentation. We appreciate your flexibility within that 30 minutes because you had a lot of good data to share. I strongly encourage everyone to follow up with her in her research later on. We can answer a quick question really quick. Let's just do one. We've got a couple in the chat. So if your question is not answered, please get in touch with Dr. Telenko later. What is your opinion on V5, V6 fungicide applications in corn?
I guess its question is, what are you going to be using them for? If your idea is that you're going to put them out early because you want to get across, but feel that you're going to be managing the diseases, by the time most of our diseases are active, those fungicides are going to be running out of steam. So that's my one comment on going early. I guess that, that's the one question. You're looking at this new diseases, we're still trying to understand its biology. If it jumps in early, that's when maybe an earlier application may be effective. But from the last few years, again, the VT for managing disease-wise, the VTR1 is when we want to go when they're most active, when they're moving up into that crop canopy, when we're protecting that ear leaf and above.
Thank you so much, Dr. Telenko. Perfect timing. We really appreciate you joining us tonight. We will prepare to move on to our final presentation. Just a few housekeeping reminders. Please do not log off. You must attend the entire program to receive a pesticide applicator, private applicator, or commercial credits today. We will be posting a link in the chat immediately following Dave Osborne's talk here shortly. Dave promised to go pretty quick, so we will make sure we give everyone the link. If you are on a telephone, please stay past the end of the meeting. We would like to explain a different procedure for offering you credit since you are not on the screen. So if you're on a telephone and you are seeking pesticide applicator credit, please remain on the meeting toward the end. We will discuss how to certify your credits at that time. With that, I'd like to introduce our final speaker, Dave Osborne, a friend and mentor of mine, our A&R and 4-H educator and County Extension Director in Ripley County. He's going to be